It takes 3 inputs, a red, a green, and a blue, does some magic behind the scenes, and then gives us a color back. So what we're going to do here is use another function called URL. So what this is going to do is take in the link or to a URL, and then it's going to find that image and set it. So in quotations, it does have to be in quotations, just remember that. You're then going to paste in your image. So remember, I just copied this from the image address, and now we have it here. So we have the image. Let's go ahead and check it out on our website. So there we go. You can see that, you can see that our image is set here. Now, there's a few issues, obviously, with the repetition and everything, but we're not going to be covering those until maybe in a few videos where we talk about some other background properties. But there we go. For now, we've actually set our image, and now it is set on our website. So when you think of a URL, you're most likely thinking of linking to Google Images or some sort of web URL. But that's not the only type of URL that we can use. A URL is just a link to an endpoint. This right here is a URL. It's just not linking to a website. It's instead linking to a local picture or style sheet or whatever you're trying to link to. So what I'm actually going to show you is that we can use these local URLs in here. So I'm going to erase this. It's a little bit long. Now I'm going to paste in our new URL here. Go ahead and refresh the page. And now you can see that it still works perfectly. Because again, it's linking to an endpoint. It's just not on a website. It's instead stored on our local machine. So there we go. We have that set up now. But there's actually another way that you can set background images. And this goes the same for background colors. So why I like to use the background property is because you can set anything you want in one go. You can set it as a color, as an image, and you can do many other things. But instead, you can actually use very specific properties that work for specific values. So for example, in this case, we can use background image. And from here, we can go ahead and copy paste the URL like that. Make sure to add your semicolon. Now I'm going to go ahead and erase this and show you that it still works perfectly fine. So you can see I refreshed the page and it's still working. And this goes the same for background colors. You can go ahead and add a background color and then add some random RGB value. I'm just going to go for a full black for now. And you can see that it still works. The only problem is if I go ahead and paste in that URL here, if I go ahead and paste in that URL here, just going to link to it straight. Just like that. So if I go ahead and add the URL to the color, it's not going to work because this is specifically for colors. Alright, so there we go. That's pretty much it for background images. It's quite easy to use. All you have to do is make sure that you have a working URL. You can just test it by putting it in and seeing if the background's loading properly. And from there, just use your URL function and a suitable property, such as background or background image, and you should be good to go. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be looking at some more background properties. Now, we're not going to be looking at all of them because most of these aren't really useful and they're not really used in everyday life. But what I'm going to be doing is showing you the main properties that you can use with backgrounds that can really change how your backgrounds look. So we're actually going to be covering only two in this video. So that's background size and background repeat. So the first thing I want to cover is background repeat because I think it's the most important. So you can see we have our background there. I already set the height and width. Don't worry about these values or the properties or anything. Again, we'll talk about those later in this course. But for now, you can see that we have our background here, which is actually inside of a div. So I set the div height and width, and now there's a background here. So I want to mess around with this background and see what I can do. So first of all, you'll notice that we can see here that we have, so for example, 2 or 3 or 4 of the same image, and pretty much what's happening is the image is being repeated so that it can fill up all of the content space. Now this is done by default because again, all of the values and pixels and the dimensions are absolute. They're not like other programs where you can just throw a picture on there and it'll automatically resize. When you're working with web development, it takes those raw dimensions and just plugs them straight into the website. So that's why we need to do a little bit of styling. So you can see that this image is big enough, and remember, because this is a direct image, what's happening here is we have an image tag, and then the image is just being plugged straight in there. Whereas with here, we don't actually have an image tag. What we have is an empty div, which is just, think of it, if you don't know what that is, think of it as a container. It has a width and height of this much, but then this is an empty box. What we're doing is filling it with this image. So instead of plugging the image straight in, we're just filling an empty box with these images. And of course, the image isn't big enough to fill it. So what we have to do is, or what HTML actually does by default, is repeat this. So if you don't want that, there is an easy way to fix it. Now, it's probably not going to give you the result that you expected, but what you're going to do is go ahead and say background dash repeat. And pretty much you can either set this to no repeat, which is the default, or, repeat is the default, yeah. So repeat is going to be the default value. But if you want to set it to no repeat, this is pretty much going to remove that repeating property. Now, although it might look like now this image is going to cover the whole thing, watch what happens. You can see that it only takes up that small box. And this might look like it just resized everything, but if I go ahead and add a background color to this, like that, and I'm just going to say red, and I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see what's actually happening here is that we have the image and it's not taking up the full image. If I go ahead and set this to repeat, now the background is taking up the full image. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and set this to a basic steel blue. I think that's one of my favorite CSS name colors. So there we go. Now that we know how to adjust the repetition of these backgrounds, why don't we go ahead and actually talk about background size, because that's the important one that's going to allow us to fill this whole container. So first of all, now that we know that background repeat just changes if it repeats or not, we need to know how to alter the size. And we can do this using a property called background size. So I'm going to go ahead and actually erase this because we don't need it for now. Just like that. So you can actually go ahead and set the size of the background. And remember, depending on whether you set it to repeat or not, this is going to change your effect. So right now it's still on repeat since we removed that property. But pretty much the way to manipulate this is the first value is going to be the height. So for example, let's say I wanted to take up 50 pixels. Then with a direct space, remember no commas, nothing, you're going to then enter the width. So I'm going to say maybe 100 pixels. Let's go ahead and refresh now. And you can see that because our repeat is actually off, our repeat is on, we can see that it just keeps repeating until this whole space is filled up. Now, obviously it's going to be pretty hard to get this exactly at the dimensions. If I actually go ahead and set this to 400 pixels and 70%, we didn't really talk about percentages much, you can see it's still repeating. So it's very hard to get this working in the way that you want it to cover the whole thing exactly, even if you use the direct values. So there's actually a keyword that you can use to fix this up. All you have to do is type cover here. So if we go ahead and refresh, you can see now the image takes up the full width. And although it sacrifices the quality, pretty much what's happening here is this cover value is going to resize the image based on the dimensions just right so that it fits this whole thing. There's also one more keyword that you can use, which is called contain. But the only problem is with contain is it's going to resize it as much as possible. The only problem is it's trying to resize it without messing with the proportions. So let's say that this is maybe a 2:1 ratio. So for every 2 widths, there's 1 height. So let's just use that as an example. Basically what's happening here is that no matter how much you stretch this, you cannot go the full way without stretching it off the screen. So contain doesn't do that. Instead, it just repeats the image. Now, if we actually change this back to cover, you can see that it does cut off part of that image because it just stretches it out the full way until the image or the background covers the full width. So there you go. That's pretty much it for background size. Now I would recommend going instead not with the sizing option, pixels, but instead using the cover keyword or the contain keyword if you know that your proportions are right or if you need it for some other purpose. So yeah, pretty much those are the two main other background properties that you're going to be using. Obviously there's many more, but they're not as useful and they don't really make as much of a difference as these two. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be talking a little bit more about RGB colors, but we're actually going to be adding one more feature to this. So right now we've talked about RGB, which is our basic color set. We have a red, a green, and a blue, but there's actually one more that we're missing out on that can really improve the quality of our colors, and that's A, or alpha. So right now you can see we have an RGB color code, but what if we wanted to add this mysterious alpha component? What will we do? So I'm actually going to go ahead and use it as the background. Well, the first thing you need to do is change the RGB name to RGBA. And in this way, we've completely changed the way the color looks. Now, if we go ahead and refresh the page, nothing's changed. But now we can actually manipulate that alpha value. So all we have to do is after blue, keep getting those two mixed up. After the final value, you're going to add another comma. And here is where you can put any value between 0 and 1. So now that you know what you can do with it, alpha is pretty much the transparency or opacity of a color. 0 meaning it's completely transparent, you can't see it at all, and 1 meaning it's fully visible. Think of this in percentages. For example, 0 is 0% and 1 is 100%. 0.5 would be 50%. So if you think of it that way, you can really think about opacity in a much easier way. So I'm going to go ahead and actually set 0.4. So right now we're at 0 or 40% opacity. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that the color is still there, it's just a lot lighter. Now you're probably asking, why don't you just go and maybe make the color lighter? Well, it's actually much easier to control it this way, and on top of that, if you want things like maybe fading, or you want to maybe change a color, fade it into a different one, you can't really just change the color every time, because in animation, it's much easier to just change the opacity, reduce it or increase it, than change the color every time. So it's also much easier to use RGBA colors when you're trying to just control the overall look of a color. So usually when you're using just simply RGB colors, you can only get a certain look, but once you add opacity into the mix, you can completely change the way that it looks. So pretty much here's the takeaway that you're supposed to take from this video. You can have a fourth component to an RGB color, which is A. Now this becomes an RGBA color. Now this A value stands for alpha, or opacity, or transparency, whatever you want to call it. Then this value isn't like just from 0 to 255. Instead, you have to set a value between 0 and 1. If you think of it in terms of percentages, it becomes a lot easier. 0 being the no or 0 when there is no transparency, when it's fully transparent, and then 1 being when it's completely visible. Alright, so that's pretty much it for this RGBA color scheme. It's very easy to use. You don't really need to use a color picker for that. You can just think about how opaque you want it, and from there you can set your value. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, this is going to be talking about the last feature with using colors, and it's a little bit hard to grasp at first, but once you start using it, you can really get used to it. So we're going to be working with gradients in this video. And for now, I'm just going to go ahead and erase this background. And I'm just going to have a single color. So I'm just going to say steel blue. And I'm going to also erase this color property. So now we have a background of the steel blue color. There we go. So now it's working. So pretty much, if you don't know what a gradient is already, it's kind of a transition between two colors. So it's not just a sharp red to blue in one go. It smoothly moves or diffuses through the colors. So for example, you start just completely red, and then you move up, along, and as you go up, it gets more and more blue. So you're sort of mixing between the two colors. So if you've ever done any painting before, or used maybe coloring pencils, if you kind of use paint and draw between the two colors, depending on the proportions between them, it's going to make sort of a purplish, and then it transitions like that. So pretty much that's what's going on here with our gradients, is we're transitioning between two colors. Now, of course, you can do more than two. You can put 3, 4, you can put as many colors as you want. But pretty much what you have to take away from this is that a gradient is just a transition between a number of colors. Okay, so now that we know what a gradient is, let's go ahead and get started adding them. So there are actually two types of gradients, radial and linear. So radial gradients are circular. They kind of move outwards from a center, and depending on the percentages or how much you want of each color, it's going to change the way the gradient looks. A linear gradient, on the other hand, is the one that I described earlier, a smooth red transition to blue. It could go from left to right, top to bottom, and even diagonally, depending on how we define the direction later in this video when we start creating our gradients. Alright, let's get started. So the first thing I want to work with is linear gradients. So the way to do this, just with our RGBA or our URL, all we have to do is type linear dash gradient, just like that. And from here, we can start defining our directions. So if you don't already know about directions already, pretty much there are 4 different positions: top, bottom, left, and right. And you can also combine the two to create corners. So for example, top right would be the top right corner. So first of all, what you're going to want to do is type 2, and then you're going to say the name of the direction. So in this case, I'm just going to say to right. So what this is going to be saying is you want the gradient to move to the right side. So it's going to be going this way. Now, there's also another way to do this I'll talk about in just a second, but for now, let's leave it like this. And then after your comma, you're going to add as many colors as you want. So in this case, I'm going to add red and blue. And remember to separate them also by a comma. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what's happening. You can see that we have a red slowly transitioning into a blue to the right side. So remember, it starts with the first color and moves on. Let's go ahead and add a green in there, and then a steel blue, and then a blue. Now we have 4 colors that are slowly transitioning. We have a red that slowly transitions into a green, and then a steel blue, you can sort of see it there, and then a blue. And just saying, we don't actually have to use these name colors. I just wanted to use them because it looked, it was quite easy to look at. So what we can actually do, and here's your first use for opacity, is you can go ahead and let's just take a random color here. So to right, remember this is starting here. We're going to paste in that color, but then we're going to finish it with an RGBA color, like that. And pretty much what's going to happen is this is going to be a slowly fading out color, just like this. So you can see what's happening is we start with a fully functional color, which has a full has no transparency at all, and we slowly make it fade more and more out until we can't see the picture at all. Or the color in this case. So yeah, that's pretty much a great way of looking at it, and that's pretty much it for linear gradients. Let's talk about actually making diagonal gradients now. So we know that we can have to right, we can also have to top, for example, if you wanted to start from the bottom, just like that, and you can see now it goes up. But what if we wanted to make it diagonal? So let's say we wanted to finish in the bottom right corner. What you would do is just type it out like this, to bottom right. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that it slowly goes down and fades out just at the bottom right. So there we go. That's pretty much it for positioning. But there's actually another way to do this, and it's through angles. So if you don't already know how to use angles, then you can pretty much skip this step because it's quite hard to get the use of it. But once you learn how to actually work with angles and you know how to, move them around, things like that, it becomes very easy to work with them. So let's say you wanted them to go in a very specific direction. So for example, you wanted it to end somewhere here. Now obviously you can't use words for positioning because they only work at certain places, such as the corners. So if you wanted to do this, you're going to have to go ahead and use angles. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and erase this part because we're not using positioning, and then we're going to go ahead and type our angle. So the first thing I'm going to do is define the place that I want it to end. So let's say this time I wanted it to end on the left here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say minus 90, because remember what's happening here is we want it to just flip completely around. So let's say this is our starting angle, it's 0, and we go all the way down minus 90. So if you don't already know, 90 is kind of a quarter turn. And what's going to happen is from here, we can type DEG, or degrees, and this is going to set the angle that we want it at. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. you can see that now it goes from right to left. Now, this is a pretty bad example considering we can just do this normally by typing to left. But why don't we go ahead and choose something a little bit more specific? So I'm going to go 146 degrees. So just remember that pointing upwards is kind of the starting position. And then we turn 90 degrees and then just a little bit over halfway. And I think that's not a very good example, so I'm going to go with 160. Now you can see once I refresh the page that it ends sort of around the corner, but not exactly on. And if I actually go ahead and add something like maybe 215, something like that, go ahead and refresh, you can see that they are ending in different places. It's a lot more specific. Now, it's not very obvious with this kind of fading color, but what's happening here is we can directly control where we want our gradient to end. So that's one way of using linear gradients. Now let's go ahead and talk about the next type of gradient, which are radial gradients. So first of all, I'm just going to erase this whole thing here because I don't really need it. Now, radial gradients don't work in the same way that linear ones do. Instead of having a specified direction, so for example, you want to go from right to left or from top to bottom, instead what happens is we can actually define the percentages or proportions of each color that we want. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually this background size. So one thing you need to note is that you cannot specify the cover background size or anything like that for these radial gradients because they just won't work. So what we're going to have to do is go ahead and remove this. There we go. Now let's go ahead and add our radial gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and type radial dash gradient, just like that. And now what we can do is specify a certain amount of colors. So for example, I'm just going to start out with red and blue. Now if we refresh the page, you can see it starts off red and ends at blue. But we can actually add more than two colors. Just like with our linear gradient there, what we can actually do is go ahead and type in, let's just say green. That's an example. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that we've added a third color. Now, if we wanted to change the proportions, so for example, let's pretend that this blue is taking up too much space. We don't want that much. We can actually specify how much we want of each. So to change the proportions, what we can do is go ahead and add percentages. So what I'm going to do first is go and specify what I want here. Now, one thing to note is that these have to be in order. You have to have the minimum percentage or the smallest percentage at the start and then the largest at the finish. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with something small, like 20%. Then I'm going to have, let's say, 40% blue and 55% green. So now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that there is a lot more green and a lot less blue and red. So the final thing I want to cover for radial gradients is the shape. Now you can actually specify the shape that you want. Now right now I have an ellipse or sort of oval shape, but we can actually change it. All we have to do is type the name of the shape. Now there are two values you can put here, ellipse, which is the default, and circle. I'm going to go ahead and type circle. Now if I go ahead and refresh, you can see that this is in a much more circular shape rather than the previous oval. And although it's not a perfect circle, obviously our proportions are going to change what it looks like. Alright, so that's pretty much it for gradients. There's quite a lot to learn about these, and there's a lot more features that you can cover. But for now, I think this is great. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and just create another gradient, another linear gradient right under this one, just so you can see what it looks like. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and maybe let's just go for the body background for now. I'm going to go ahead and actually add a linear gradient here. And I'm going to say, let's just say to bottom, because again, we want it to kind of stretch from top to bottom. So now what we're going to do is start off very strong. So we're going to have our main RGBA color or our main color here. So I'm going to copy this. So this is going to be a fully visible color starting from the top. And then we're going to end with a much less visible color. So there you go. Now let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you can see that maybe there's a little bit of an error there. Forgot to spell it. There we go. Now we can go ahead and refresh, and you can see it's still not working. Still a bunch of errors here probably. Forgot the Forgot the parentheses there. Just make sure that you're doing this right, because sometimes you can make some silly errors. So for example, if you look here, we were missing a bracket. So now if we go ahead and refresh, there we go. It's a lot better now. So we start off with a nice fully visible color, and we end off with a less visible color. Alright, so there we go. That's pretty much it for gradients. You can go ahead and download this file from the project. You can go ahead and look at how everything works here, mess around with it, see what you can do, because there is a lot to gradients, and although they're not used every day, they're still very useful tools, and they can really help you out in your web development careers. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the different types of units in CSS. So far we've been working with some basic coloring techniques. We've learned about selectors and then different properties, and then we've learned about some of these different values, but we haven't actually learned what all of these different things mean, this px, this percentage, and we don't actually know how they work. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about some of the different types of units and how you can identify which one to use. So first thing I want to talk about is the difference between the two types of units, which are absolute units and relative units. So firstly, we have to talk about some of the units we've already been using. For example, pixels. Now pixels is a little bit special. I'll explain it to you in just a second. But pretty much the commonly used absolute units are things like centimeters, millimeters, and inches, which are absolute. It's not dependent on anything else. If you set it as 1 inch, it's going to be 1 inch long, no matter if you're doing it on a phone or an ultra-wide TV. So that's what absolute units are. They aren't affected by anything around them. The second group are relative units, and these are a little bit different. Relative units are usually dependent on something. So for example, our percentage unit here is dependent on the parent element's, unit. So for example, if this service image here, where is it? Here, has a width of 70%, then that means that the parent element of this service image, or this service image right here, which in this case is our body, takes 70% of its width, of its total width. So the whole way through of the body is 100%, and 70% is going to be somewhere around here, because that's what we set it as. Now notice that when I start resizing this, you can see that it still takes up 70%. And obviously, right now it doesn't work because I haven't refreshed the page, but you can see no matter how small I make it, it's only going to take up 70% of the total body width. So this is really good for something like a responsive design, because what happens is when you're using absolute units in a responsive design, let's say you set this width as 200 pixels. On a phone, it's going to appear very large, whereas on an ultra-wide TV, it's going to appear too small. So using something like percentages would be very useful, because then you could resize your window here however you like it and still have that look that you want. So that's pretty much it for percentages, but there's also a lot of different relative values that we can use, and I'm going to go through all of these in just a second. But the first thing I want to talk about is this special unit, which is pixels. Now, pixels is a little bit different. Now, although it is considered an absolute unit, it is actually relatively scaled based on what device you're on. So if you don't already know, your screen right now that you're watching this video on is made up of a bunch of little tiny pixels. Now, there's this concept in computing, it's called DPI. It's pretty much used to calculate the resolution of your screen. And depending on the number of pixels you have, the resolution is going to change. So on low DPI tablets or things like that, anything that has a very low resolution, so for example, if you're on YouTube and you change your resolution to 480p, what's going to happen is then the video is going to sort of adjust how many pixels are in that video. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into how pixels are changed and things like that, but pretty much what happens is on high resolution devices, these pixels aren't going to appear the same as on low resolution devices, because obviously this is taking up only 400 pixels of height. And if you have an ultra high display, a very high definition TV, 400 pixels is only going to be about half of what it is here. So what actually happens in this is on these high DPI displays, each pixel in this unit is actually taking up multiple pixels relative to the resolution of the display. So for example, on a TV, every pixel according to this height would actually take up something like 4 pixels. So this is to give it that absolute illusion. Now, although it is in theory or at its core relative, when you're actually using it, it is an absolute value. So that's just one thing you need to keep in mind. Now, don't worry too much about pixel, redefinitions, things like that. We're not focusing on that for now. We're just focusing on how we can use different values for different things. So let's go ahead and cover some of the different units that we can use for absolute units. So the easiest way to do this is through changing the size of the text. Now, again, we're going to cover this much later in this section, so don't worry about that too much. So the first one we can use is centimeters. So I can say the font size is 2 centimeters. Now, if I refresh the page, you can see that it is a lot bigger. Remember, if you actually took a ruler and measured the font size, you would get 2 centimeters. There's also many more, such as millimeters and inches, and pretty much everything in between. So you can see that's also a lot smaller. So we have our standard pixels here, but there's actually a few more that we can use. Now they're not used that commonly, so I'm not really going to go over them that much. But there are some other units that you can use instead of pixels that kind of follow that same formula. So there is something called PT, which are points, and it's a little bit bigger than a pixel. So if I go ahead and refresh that, you can see that that actually gets a little bit taller. We'll go ahead and change that back to pixels. You can see that does get quite a little bit taller. And there's also PC. Again, it's quite similar to PX and PT, but in this case, a PC is a lot bigger. So you can see how much bigger it actually is. Actually, one PC is 12 points. So that just shows you how much bigger it is. So there we go. That's just a little bit of some of the other absolute values. Now let's cover relative values. So the first one that we actually already covered was percentage. So we already looked at, our percent symbol over here, which pretty much takes up, again, a certain size or whatever value of its parent element. But there's actually many more that I want to cover. The first one I'm going to look at is EM. So pretty much what I do here is it's going to represent the size relative to the current standard font size. So let's just pretend that we know that this font size is valued. Let's just call it F. What's going to happen is if we set the body font size to 2 EM, you're going to double everything or double it based on F, which is our font size. So if I set 2 EM here, just like that, and go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that all of the text is double the standard font size. So again, this is completely relative to the standard font size. So I'm actually going to go ahead and erase this here and start using style tags instead. I feel like it's just going to be a lot easier to, move around and easily move that around. So now we've covered percent and EM. So those are the two main types of relative units, but there's actually 2 more that I want to cover, which is view width and view height. So in web design and in development in general, there's this thing called the viewport, which is pretty much the dimensions of whatever you're viewing it on. So in this case, our viewport would be the body's width and then the body's height. So VW and VH, view width and view height, actually allow you to work with this viewport in a very easy way. So 1 VW or VH is equal to 1% of the total body width or body height. So remember, this isn't based on the parent element. This is based on the total viewport. This could be the HTML document, the body tag. It depends on what you're viewing it on. So for example, if I go ahead and change the width here to 70 VW, this is pretty much equivalent to 70 times 1% of the total viewport. And obviously if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see it gets just a little bit bigger because there's actually the viewport itself is bigger than the body tag, which is the parent element. Now we'll talk about that later in the course because it's quite advanced. But what you can see here is that right here it doesn't actually affect it because the body is almost completely equivalent to the viewport. But for example, if we wanted to set the font size of one of these TDs to 70% which would be 70% of this T row, it would actually look completely different from 70 VW, which is 70% of the total viewport. So that's just one thing I want to keep in mind. You can also set more than 100%. It doesn't have to be completely set in stone. So if I actually wanted to say VH, so 400 times 1% of the view height, what would happen here is that this image would become 4 times the total height of the viewport. So that's just also one thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to pixels. And we'll just keep that width the same because it doesn't really make that much of an impact. Okay, so there we go. Those are some of the different units in CSS. I've actually attached a little reference sheet that you can use. You can refer to this lecture. You can go ahead, click on it. And if you want to revise any of these, you can. But just a fair warning, you're not really going to be using a lot of these units. The main ones you're going to use are most likely pixels and percent. But for some cases, you're going to want to use some other units. So although absolute units are still useful in some cases, so for example, if you want a very specific dimensions or viewport on your screen, so for example, if you only want users to access something on the phone, then, or a very specific phone, then you can go ahead and use pixels because it's going to look the same no matter what phone people use because it's all going to be the same. The only problem is when people start using different devices, using absolute values are going to look very different based on what device you're using. And that's why you should kind of stick to using these relative units instead of using things like pixels, centimeters, and millimeters. So things like EM, percent, view width, and view height would be very, very useful because then you can scale it based on whatever device you want. So for example, it's going to look the same, or at least this width, whether you're using it on a phone or a desktop computer, because again, it takes up 70% of the width, no matter what it is. So that's just some of the basics about some of these units. Now, like I said, you don't need to know these by heart. You can just go ahead and keep them at the back of your head. And once we start using them and start using them in our, fonts, layout, things like that, we'll actually start using these units a lot more and they will make a lot more sense. So this is just a quick introduction to these units and why we should use them. And you're not supposed to be going ahead and, completely mastering every single one by now. All right, let's move on. So the next few videos are going to be focused on font and text manipulation. So we're going to be working with actually changing how this text looks. The first thing I want to talk about is there's actually 2 parts to this section: text manipulation and font manipulation. And although they sound like the same thing, they're actually very different. So the first part in this video, we're going to be covering text manipulation. Now there's not that much to look at, but pretty much the difference between the two is that text manipulation is looking at things that you can change no matter the font. So for example, something like sizing would not apply because the size is going to be based obviously on the font itself. So basically things like underlining or capitalization are going to be completely regardless of the font. You can change them no matter what they do. But things like bolding and things like size, bolding, things like that, they are completely dependent on the font because again, the font decides how the font itself is going to look. So it decides the size, the bolding, and just the overall style. So the first part in this video, we're going to be covering text manipulation, and in the next few videos, we're going to be looking at actual font manipulation. So things like external fonts, which is probably the most exciting part of this course, and things like weight and bolding. All right, let's get started. So the first 2 things I want to cover are text decoration and text transform. So these are properties that are going to be relating to the style of the text. Now I know I just said that fonts and mostly styling is dependent on the font, but in this case, these properties don't actually rely on the font at all. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is text decoration. So although it sounds like you can do a bunch of cool things with this, the only real thing that you can do is change the lining of the text. So we're going to go ahead and work with this anchor tag here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class. Oh, there's already a class there actually. We can just go ahead and select it. So I'm going to go dot link like that. And now what I can actually do is change the lining of this right here. So by default, anchor tags have a text decoration of underline, but there's actually 3 more properties that we can use. So the property to use it is called text-decoration. It's pretty obvious. Now the first one I'm going to look at is none. So this completely removes the line from our links. They're completely gone. You don't have them anymore. The next one, which is the one by default, is underline, like that. So that's our normal link. Then you have line through, which is line dash through, and it's pretty obvious what that does. It just puts a line straight through. And then of course there's the overline, which is the line on the top. So there we go. Now we have a line on the top. Now, although you won't see the 2 that we just showed, line through and overline, very commonly, it is very common to see underline and text decoration none applied, because sometimes, and I'm sure you've seen this in websites all over the place, you can hover over links and they maybe change color. Again, we'll be learning how to do that in this course, but you know, they might change color and do all sorts of things, but you usually don't see them with an underline. So that's where this property comes into play. So I'm just going to change this back to underline, just to make things a little interesting. Next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and cover the next property, which in this case is text transform. So you can see that we have a bunch of text here. And let's say maybe we're working as a freelancer and our client wants us to capitalize all of our text. How are we going to do that? Now, obviously, we're not going to go through and capitalize every single individual word. That's going to basically be suicide. Although it is possible, it could take a lot of time. So the easiest way to do it is using the text transform property. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this on the whole body for now. The property to do this is text-transform. It's pretty easy to memorize or learn these because they don't really require any weird memorization tactics. So now what you can do is go ahead and add our value. So there are 3 different values that you can use for this: uppercase, lowercase, and capitalize. So because we want to capitalize everything, we can go ahead and type capitalize. Now, if we refresh the page, you can see every single word is capitalized without us having to actually change the text. You can also go ahead and use the other 2, which are lowercase and uppercase. And that will obviously put everything in uppercase for you. But now you're starting to see a little bit about why these are text manipulation and not font manipulation. Again, it doesn't matter what font you're using, whether you're using some weird symbol font or Times New Roman. You can always use these to capitalize it no matter what the font is. On top of that, you can also move around these lines. It's not dependent on the font at all. So that's just a little bit about our text manipulation properties. So the next feature I want to cover is text align. So this is a little bit different from the other 2 that we've covered because it's not really focused on the styling or decoration of our text. Instead, it's going to be focused on the justification or alignment of it. So if you've ever used any text editor, for example, Microsoft Word or Google Docs, anything like that, you'll know that you can justify your text and align it to your site. So there are 4 main ones that are included in CSS: left, right, center, and justify. So I'm going to breeze through the first 3 ones because it's quite easy to use, but then the last one I'm going to talk about a little bit in more detail. So in order to achieve this, you can go ahead and add the text align property. And here I'm just going to go center as an example, and you can see that now everything is aligned. So the list items are a little bit weird. They don't actually move the decoration to the center when you align it to the center. But other than that, all of the text is now aligned to the center. So now let's talk about justify. Now we're not going to go through left and right because we already know that. But what justify actually does, I'm just going to show you here, is pretty much it takes all of the text and it kind of matches it so it's all fit in the same width, if it makes sense. So although it might not fit everything in the same length, what happens is all of this text is now stretched out as far as possible. So although you might not be able to see a direct difference, let's just look at this paragraph here. I'm going to just end off this property without changing it. You can see that without the justify alignment, all of these are different. So what the justify actually does is it sets all of the lines to the same length. So I'm going to go ahead and add that justify back. So you can see this used a lot in research papers and, academic papers, essays, things like that. This justification is used a lot. And although it's not really used very commonly, it's still a very good feature if you have big bodies of text, if you're trying to, make everything look very streamlined. All right, there we go. So those are the three different types of text manipulation properties that you can use, and along with their respective values. So I encourage you to go ahead and try this out on your own. You can do a lot of things with these three values alone. You can really change how the page looks. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the other half of overall text manipulation. And in this case, we're going to be looking at different font properties. So in this video, we're going to be looking at three: font size, font weight, and font style. So first thing I want to look at is font size. So right now we have our pretty standard text here, right? So I'm just actually going to go ahead and erase our text transform from our previous video. So now we have our text here, and what I want to do is change the size of this. The only problem is I want to use a responsive design. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and first use our font size property, and then I'm going to go ahead and say, let's just say 1.25 EM. So what happens here is make this 25% more than the standard font size. Now you can see it's a little bit bigger, but it's not as big as doing something like 2 EM. So there we go. Now that we've done that, we can also go ahead and actually use pixel values if we wanted to, 40 pixels, for example. The only problem is this is going to set everything consistently. So you can see all of the sizes are the same. It doesn't matter if they're a header or, well, it does actually matter, but because in the CSS defined code, all of these headers actually have 2 EM, but if we actually removed all of these, they would be the same. So using something like 2 EM would be great, because what actually happens is now everything stays consistent, and it's also a relative unit, so that's always good because it stays responsive. So there we go. That's pretty much it for font size. I'm going to go ahead and actually change this to 1.15 EM. I think that's good. So there we go. That's the first one. Now let's go ahead and talk about font weight. So this is a little bit more complicated. So pretty much what font weight decides is the bolding of a text or a font. So the values for this can range from 0, which is nothing, all the way to, well, pretty much infinity. The only problem is most fonts only support up to 800 or 900 because, again, for each value, there's a different bolding stage. So most fonts are only going to go up to maybe 800 or 900. Some of them can go even higher, but in theory, you can make these values as big as you want. The only problem is it's not really going to show any change if you make them very big. So there we go. That's pretty much it for font weight. Let's go ahead and start adding it to our website. So let's say I wanted to make our title a little bit bolded. So I'm going to go ahead and say font-weight. And now I'm going to go ahead and specify a value. Let's go ahead and start with 0 and see what happens. You can see that nothing actually happens, but pretty much like I said before, most fonts only support certain values. So for example, 100 would be a very specific kind of bolding, 200, 300, 400, and all the way up to as much as the font supports. Now, usually the convention for this is you're supposed to go up in hundreds from 100. That's kind of like the minimum supported font size. So if I go ahead and set 100 here, you can see it's very thin. And if I go ahead and set it as 800, which is usually the highest that you should go realistically, this is kind of the standard for H1s. So there you go. You can set it to something like 600, which isn't very commonly seen. Like I said, fonts only support certain boldedness, if that makes sense. But you can go ahead and play around with this. And like I said, depending on the font, it's going to change what the text actually looks like. So there we go. That's pretty much it for font weight. I'm going to go ahead and actually just set this to 400, which is the standard font right there. So 400 is the normal. It's like normal bolding, no bolding, and don't make it very thin. So that's kind of what it's the normal range. So there we go. That's it for font weight. Now let's go ahead and look at font style. So just like font size is for size and font weight is for bolding, font style is for italicizing. So I'm going to go ahead and actually italicize a small piece of text here. So let's just go ahead into this, and I'm going to take this first part and actually just cut it out. I'm going to create a span tag. So a span tag is sort of an, if you don't know, it's an inline, it's an inline container tag, which allows you to contain certain pieces of text without, disrupting the flow or moving them onto their own line. So now I'm going to give it a class. I'm just going to say italics. I guess that would work. So then I'm going to go ahead and use the class selector, italics. Open this up. Now we're going to go ahead and start working on adding our italicizing. So what you can do for this is called font style. And although most of the selectors these days are quite easy to remember, italics and font style don't usually go hand in hand. So it might be a little hard to remember this one. So there's 3 different values that you can use for this. Normal, which is pretty much the same as setting the font weight as 400, doesn't do anything, or it actually, changes it back to its normal state. Then you have italic, which is to italicize it, and then you have oblique, which is a little bit more italicized. So let's go ahead and just add the basic one. I'm going to go ahead and type italic here. Now, if we refresh the page, you can see that where it is, there we go. It's right there. Is a little bit more, the font is a little bit more italicized. So there we go. Now let's go ahead and set it as the other value, which is oblique. And you might notice a little bit of a difference. So not immediately obvious, but it's actually just a little bit more italicized. So, like I said, it's not very noticeable, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. So there we go. I'm just going to change this back to italic, and that's pretty much it for the 3 different font manipulation techniques. Now, although I didn't cover font family, which is what I'm going to cover in the next video, these are the pretty much 3 basic ones that you can use to work with text without changing the font itself. So you can go ahead and work with changing the font weight, make it bolded, italicized. You can also change the size. So you can really do a lot with this, but font family is a little bit more complicated, which is why I want to leave it for its own video. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the last property related to text and fonts.